Alright, in this video I'm going to talk about how microbes adapt to osmotic pressure. So osmotic pressure has to do with the amount of water that's in your environment. So something that's considered hypotonic, like a pond, is when you have fresh water. And typically what happens when you have fresh water, let me kind of flip to this next slide, is that everything always wants to move down its concentration gradient from where there's a lot of it to where there is less of it. And osmosis sometimes confuses people because typically when we think about osmosis, it's sort of backwards because, you think about water wanting to move when water is typically what the solute is dissolved in. But really, if you just keep in mind that something always wants to move from where there's a lot of it to where there's a little of it, you can understand any sort of movement of concentration gradients or osmosis. So if you have a hypotonic solution, essentially what that means is outside it's very watery and inside it's very concentrated with salts or whatever's in the solution of the cytoplasm. So the water would tend to want to go from outside into the cell. So bacteria have cell walls that help to protect them from absorbing a lot of water and allowing water to move in freely, because if water did move in freely, they would burst. Now, amoebas, which are eukaryotic microbial organisms, they sometimes can actually pump water out of the cell using vacuoles, so like little vesicles that they send water out of the cell to sort of maintain their hypotonic state. Now, hypertonic conditions are when you have high salt conditions on the outside, and therefore you're a little bit, I guess you would say, waterier, or you have more water on the inside. And so what would tend to want to happen is that the water from the inside would want to move out, right? Because it's going to want to move where there's a lot of water to where there is a little water. And so conditions like this are like the Great Salt Lake or the Dead Sea, where there's a high salt concentration. So if we look at these scenarios, so we have hypotonic and hypertonic you see up here, but you also can see this sort of isotonic situation. Isotonic situation is where the concentration outside is the same as the concentration inside, and then you don't really have to worry about that. But if we're dealing with a situation where hypotonic, water tends to want to come in, and if water is allowed to come in freely without being protected by that cell wall, or if there's something wrong with the cell wall, then the cell would fill up with water until it bursts like a balloon. Now, in a hypertonic situation, in that case, the water wants to leave because there's more water inside than outside. And if that was allowed to happen without a cell wall of some sort, then that cell would desiccate or dry up. So microbes can live under all sorts of different conditions and have adapted to live under any sort of osmotic pressure. However, a majority of them are either hypotonic or isotonic. And the reason is because we're a water-based planet. There's a lot of water around, a lot of fresh water around, and even the oceans tend to be sort of isotonic situations because they're not that salty. But there are some bacteria that are considered Hallow Files. So these are bacteria that prefer high salt concentrations. And so if we look at this picture up here, this is picture of the San Francisco Bay, and these are evaporation ponds where essentially what they do is they pull water and they trap them in these flats, and they try and pull out salt from the ocean, so sea salt. And in each one of these evaporation ponds there's more water that has been evaporated off, and you can see that the salinity is different, it has a different percentage, and the reason why you can see that is because there are different bacteria that are growing in these that are making them different colors. So this yellow and this red and this orange color are all a result of different bacteria that are growing at sort of high salt concentrations because water is evaporating and these pools are getting really salty. So bacteria that lives where there is a lot of salt is called a Hallow File. Now, in keeping in tow with the idea of osmotic pressures and the availability to water, there's also the idea of organisms living where there isn't a lot of access to water. So there are organisms that like to live in very dry environments and sand in the desert, and these organisms are considered xerophiles. Now, in order to sort of maintain your osmotic pressure, there are some things that you can do in order to maintain this pressure. I mentioned a second ago about the amoebas. And so some organisms can undergo forms of active transport. And when they actively transport stuff, they're either bringing stuff into the cell or putting stuff outside of the cell in order to balance out that osmotic pressure. So large molecules, particles can be engulfed or endocytosed into the cell in a vacuole. Phagocytosis is when an organism engulfs an entire whole cell or a very large cell matter. Endocytosis is when we're talking about smaller molecules. And pinocytosis is even smaller when it's thinking about when you're looking at engulfing liquids or oils. And again, this is all the idea of transferring either water or solutes in order to affect your osmotic pressure. Alright, in the next video I will then talk about adaptations to temperature variations.